gives me great pleasure to welcome Dr. Vyakarnam. Dr. Shay's career in entrepreneurship began almost accidentally when in the concluding chapter of his PhD, he recommended that business schools should take enterprise and new venture creation seriously if they were to be relevant to society. This was in 1987. Since then, it has been a pioneering journey at a number of universities where his courses for entrepreneurship, rather than about entrepreneurship, have taken root. These include Cambridge, Reading, Cranfield, and several other institutions, having established entrepreneurship centers at Nottingham Business School, Cambridge Judge Business School, and most recently, he has been a director of the Bettany Center for Entrepreneurship at Cranfield. The focus of his work is to enable managers and owners of science and technology-enabled businesses to unlock hidden value in their ideas, turn them into business proposals, and have the confidence and self-belief to take their ideas forward, whether this is for startups, scale-ups, or established businesses. Over the career, he has had the good fortune to advise and mentor hundreds of entrepreneurs, their teams, and support business readiness for growth and scale up. He continues to do this and enjoys seeing the impact in a very direct way. And without further ado, I would love to hand over to Dr. Shay. Welcome, Dr. Shay.
Thank you very much. Thank you for the invitation, Diane, and to the Hydrogen Group. I want to launch straight into the presentation because you've done such a great introduction of me. I don't need to say any more about that. And let me see if this technology, there we go. Hopefully it's working okay. So I guess the best way to do this is to say good day, because it's probably your afternoon and in the middle of the night for me. And Diane and the team have very kindly offered to record this during my day and your night. So there lies the challenge. The topic being commercialization of technology. And having met Diane actually via LinkedIn introductions, I'm very pleased to be able to drop into your conference in the way that I'm doing. The purpose behind this talk is to tell you a little bit about something called the triple chasm model and why it's so important to commercialization. You might say, what on earth is the triple chasm model? Well, I'm going to try and lay it out to you. I'll introduce it a little bit through reflecting on the innovation management literature, but I promise you just in 2 slides that have taken place over the last 50 years that have been so informative to so many of the models that we use when we talk about innovation, we talk about commercialization of technology. They are grown from deep understanding of practice. They're also now in need of some refreshment. We took a look at this innovation management literature. When I say we, that's my co-author and I. We spent about 7 years overall on the project, actually. And I'll talk to you about that. We looked at thousands of data points from hundreds of companies. And we think we have some fresh insights into the process of innovation, the journey of commercialization, if you will. And then we can ask the question, so what? What does this mean to us in practice? Well, innovation management has been going on since the 1950s. And one of the early entrants to this field was a man called Everett Rogers. And most of you, if not all of you, will be familiar with this famous model of his, which talks about the adoption of adoption of innovation, I beg your pardon. And what he meant by that was what sort of customers need to adopt your technology, and how do they adopt your technology in order for you to make progress into the marketplace. He put forward the idea that there was a group of people called innovators, about 2.5% of the marketplace. When you knew how big the market was, you could assess that. Then he talked about something called early adopters that would copycat from the first group, and then the majority, early and late majority, and finally, those of us that are now buying golf ball typewriters, if you can remember that far back. So if this is the adoption curve, they then overlaid that into what's described as the diffusion curve, i.e. how your products go into the market. And that diffusion curve you see is the S line over there. Now, I have to say, Rogers was really good. When he came up with this idea back then, he had no data. But what he did have was insight from his father's farm machinery being sold, the agrochemicals being sold, and the lines that you see which separate innovators, early adopters, and the majority, the so-called inflection points, if you like. He came up with that from a statistical model that he simply described as standard deviations from the mean. So he used 1 and 2 standard deviations to describe when the inflection took place. When you have no data, when you have nothing else, this is at least an attempt at a scientific model. That has become folklore in marketing books, textbooks for students on undergraduate and business courses of various kinds. It's become the language of the day in most innovation journals and magazines and practitioners and managers and everybody else. So we looked at this, and my co-author Uday and myself, we said, this is a really powerful model, but without any data to back this up, is this actually correct? And that's what the curiosity was for us, because intuitively it made a lot of sense, but in practice we couldn't see how it was working. So I guess our curiosity then led us to the second piece of work, which was done by Geoffrey Moore, who was a great salesman. Geoffrey Moore's book, Crossing the Chasm, hence the triple chasm, we're borrowing from his language. And he talked about Rogers's work early on. His book was in the 1990s, published, I think, in 2002. And he talked about innovators and early adopters, how they get going, the ideas come up, the little light bulb. Then he said there's a chasm. Then we don't understand what the big market actually wants. So he used a lovely metaphor of the bowling alley. He said if you hit the number 1 pin, it knocks all the others down. So what's your landing spot? Where is it you need to come into? And he then described the chasm also as a bit of a tornado. You get into that, you get into massive confusion, and then you hit the main street, and then it's total assimilation as you go forward. Both really colorful, but interestingly, if you were to read Geoffrey Moore's book, or if you have already, you'll realize it is a salesman's book based on nothing more than anecdote and experience. There is no data actually to back this up. My co-author spoke with him, and he said, data? What data? Right? So I don't want to speak on other people's behalf, but both Everett Rogers and Geoffrey Moore have given us really fundamental understanding of an innovation journey based on what you might call a good hypothesis and storytelling. So this, again, bugged us because, again, we thought, intuition tells us this is correct. Our experience tells us this is about right. But what is the data to back it up? Hence, the 7 years and thousands of data points later, we came up with this very frightening graph, which shows all the data points of journeys that companies have made across a range of periods of time. And we found that the axis, the y-axis, which again looks terrifying on this, and I'll explain a little bit more to you, is when you're looking at growth, rather than looking at sales numbers or rather looking at profitability or headcount, why not look at the acquisition of customers, the number of customers that you have relative to the number of customers you might gain in the marketplace overall. Hence, you get C over C max. What percentage of customers have you got now compared to what the total might be that you can get? And the one that you see at the top of the line there just says 100%. That's one of everything. So what's the proportion of that? What you begin to see, there's a massive density of little blue dots after Chasm 1 and fewer companies as you go further along. So what is this trying to tell us? Well, let's put this into something else. Let's give you an example of these two curves. So if you say what's the net change, the change in the number of customers that you have against the total possibility as your y-axis, and the x-axis, the horizontal line, is the total amount of time this will take, T max. I will come on to that in the next slide. So then what you have is saying, hang on a minute, so how many customers have you got by the time you hit Chasm 1, or by the time you get to Chasm 2, or by the time you get to Chasm 3? So if you look at the top of the graph, you'll find there's 0, you find 0.1, 0.3, and 0.5. What we're saying to you is that by the time you've reached your second chasm, and I'll explain a little bit more what that means to you, is you might have only 30% of the total customer base available to you, right? Or sorry, it's taken a third of the time to get to the possibility of 10% of your customer base. Right? So you have a very long way to go yet, very long way to go. So your total customer base of about 10%, and it's taken you between a third and a fifth and half the amount of time to get there. So this has a lot of implication for venture capitalists, business angels, and others, all of whom have this sort of mythical 7-year line with a 3 to 4 year exit plan, all this other stuff that goes on, and the so-called Death Valley curve. All of those lines are exaggerated when you actually look at the data in play. This chart also tells you what you need to do as managers. I'll come on to that next. But before that, just to say that all this 7 years of work has resulted in 2 books. The first one is more what we would describe as the academic book, with a colorful title, Camels, Tigers, and Unicorns, to saying, how does all this data play out? And the second book is more practical. Our scale-up manual is kind of like the so what of what we've understood. So what are our insights then that we can offer you? Well, one of them is we tried to look at the timeline. So how long does it take typically in certain types of industries to get us to the total number of customers we have, to get the level of maturity? We reckon that in media and entertainment, it might be about 5 years, 5 to 6 years. Telecoms about 8.5. And as you scroll down, software is quite quick, over 5. Electronics computing about 10, 11 years. And what you'll notice there, oil and gas is about 9 to 10 years, right? So these are quite long timelines, and energy and lighting also about 9 years. Aerospace, we think, is probably the longest because of the regulators involved in that. This will give you, I mean, this is like a temperature gauge. Every country, every nation, every region might have its own timelines available. In some cases, it might be even 20 years, simply because it's just that long to get going. But if you understand you're in it for the long journey, the question is, how long does it take you to get there? Combine that with an insight into how many customers you need to have to feel that sense of maturity and how you get to those customers. We then end up with trying to map this on with, so what do you need to do as managers? So our other insight is to say the top 4 ideas you see there, market spaces, framing the proposition, customer definition, distribution, are the externally facing management tools that you need to work with. The green items, the 6 of them at the bottom, are the internal resources. And so if you take your role as a manager, your job is to deploy those scarce resources, i.e. the green items below, to the best opportunities, which are the sort of dark blue at the top, in the best way you can. That's your job. Yes, you need to make money for the shareholders, but if you can't deploy scarce resources to the opportunities out there, you can't actually build a business. And so we describe at the moment 2 of these sort of trade-off constructs or vectors, if you will, as your strategy for commercialization and the business models coming together. So those are the levers by which you can balance out your resources, the green stuff down below, with the dark blue at the top. So I've already introduced you to the idea of a chasm. What does that mean for us? So it's just a method of prioritization that you need to do a little bit of everything as an early stage entrepreneur because you're playing on your own. But there are 2 things you really need to focus on. One of them is actually understanding what the proposition is in a competitive environment. And the second thing is, does your thing actually work? Right? This is such an important element. Now, this is where people use the lean startup methodology, perhaps. They keep trying out different ways of saying which sweet spot in the marketplace they can get to, how they frame it, and they keep iterating the technology and deploy it and change it and use different hypotheses to get there. Our statement would be, yeah, you need to do all of that when you get to Chasm 1, but even before that, you really need to understand the marketplace so thoroughly. Otherwise, you will be going around in circles and spending huge sums of money on pivoting from one idea to the next. But this, at the end of the day, is actually in reality an absolute focus for the very early stage tech company. So the commercialization journey, does your thing work and who is it for? So once, hopefully, you get past Chasm 1, you need money, you need customers, you need a team, you need your own determination and motivation to get there. Then you get towards the journey of growth. And as you begin to grow, you hit Chasm 2. And Chasm 2 is when you stop building a product and you need to start building a business. Way more complicated, way more questions. And because I'm ambassador of the Silverstone Technology Cluster, which is a race circuit in the UK, there's a technology cluster of advanced engineering companies based out there, and I've had some contact with them recently. And so I thought, why not give you a little example of what Chasm 2 might look like and the kind of questions that came up in those companies. Now, the other thing before I go on to that is that everything now is important. This is where the proverbial fertilizer hits the fan, right? This is why you need such a good quality team that is aligned on vision and values. Otherwise, it's too much to do. And if the vision and values are not aligned, it begins to fall apart. So what are the vectors here? For example, what market space are we in? Are we an advanced engineering company, or are we a motorsport company that goes racing? In other words, we do advanced engineering to finance our motorsport, or are we doing motorsport to prove the quality of our advanced engineering? Those kind of questions come up. Are we in B2B or B2C? Are we dealing with OEMs, racing teams? Who are our customers? We need to be really clear, otherwise it can be a little bit too overwhelming. So one of the motorsport companies recently has moved into batteries, for example. So the name of that company is no longer relevant. They're now a battery company. They're not a racing company anymore. Are we selling time or selling solutions? You know, how do we frame the proposition? And then the messaging and communication that goes across all the distribution channels needs to be so precise only when we know what it is we're selling and to whom. And a lot of questions need answering at this point, for which you need an experienced commercial team to help you figure things out. Then what's the resources? Well, IP management, there might well be some patents, but there might also be some secret sauce, knowing how to do things. This is very often the case in service companies as opposed to product companies. The manufacturing challenges in the motorsport areas, are we making for ourselves? Are we making for other people? So how do we manage the costs involved in that? Are we engineers or are we race teams? Right? So very different set of questions here. The product or the service, if we're in engineering, it might be that we price for a product, but actually we sell a service. So what's the synthesis between the two of them? And for example, are we going e-racing, cars, batteries? How do we deploy technology? Is it, aerodynamics? Is it pressure? Is all kinds of things come into it. In our sector, of the hydrogen sector, we've got so many other technologies, systems engineering that comes into it, pressure, fluidics, temperatures, corrosion, rust, all kinds of issues arise in the technology deployment environment. Health and safety, of course, big in our sector, the health and safety sector of oil and gas. And then we come to teams, leadership, culture, what are they? I'm not going to rehearse that because I suspect they're common to all of us. And what kind of funding and investment do we want? Well, in motorsport, we talk about sponsors. I don't think we can talk about that in hydrogen so much, maybe not. But these are the so-called vectors that you need to get your head around. And the management team needs to put all this together to go beyond building a product into building a business. So from that headline of the 12 vectors I've shown you just a moment ago, you need to dive deep because there's no substitute for that. And the next picture I'm going to show you is a slightly frightening one. But this picture, which I don't expect you to be able to read the detail, shows you those 12 vectors in the first column. We have then taken that and added layers of detail to what we describe as the sub-vectors, i.e., when you say a market space, what do you mean by that? What's the character of that? What's the value chain within it? Who are the players? Who's the competition? And so it goes on, the detail goes into that. And then you'd say, okay, hang on a minute, where does this framework help you against all the other existing methods that are there, like lean startup, growth matrix, business model canvas, etc. So if you take just the business model canvas or the lean startup, see the lean startup helps very clearly with one of the vectors in a really powerful way. It doesn't deal with the other 11 vectors much at all. And the business model canvas deals with about 4 or 5 of these vectors really well, but then the rest of them, it doesn't deal with. So we would argue that by using the detailed thinking that comes out of the vector approach of the triple chasm model, you can cover more of the basis of what it takes to build a business as opposed to designing a product. So done that. This is an early stage company which is trying to clean up the Baltic Sea. As we see what those 12 vectors are now looking like this spidergram. And on the left-hand side, you find that sort of this reddish brownish line is where the company thinks they are in terms of how well they're performing against the 12 vectors, because we managed to quantify it. The bird shape is the ideal scenario. They're doing the technology deployment and setting out their value proposition. And so they look like they're doing really well. Interestingly, if you then look at how they're doing now against their second chasm, you find that the relevance of the chasm, which is based on the data of hundreds of our companies, is showing one diagram, and you see the blue line that shows them needing to do some work on about 5 or 6 of the vectors. So this tool then gives the entrepreneurs a basis on which to measure their growth and development and have a really good conversation with their team members. So that's kind of what the insight is giving us. And so to summarize, I think we're building on earlier excellent work done by the likes of Everett Rogers and Jeffrey Moore and so on. And of course, the innovation gurus as well that have informed us, Christensen, people like that. But we just needed data. We were not happy with just the stories. We hope very much to have contributed to new insights to the commercialization of technology, that you have a much bigger picture that you need to include, going beyond thinking product to thinking how to build a business, a sustainable long-term business. Of course, if you'd like to learn more, by all means, go to our website. There's some free resources there. But of course, I have to promote the book and to say, if you'd like to know more, as a famous saying from an old book, Bark is willing. And I'd just like to close with a thank you, Diane, for inviting me. I hope those little insights were useful and interesting. And there's the links to our website. And of course, we're creating a commercialization community in LinkedIn, and hopefully some of you will come on there and we can continue the conversation. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for your very informative talk, Dr. Shai. I am a lot more curious now about what it takes, what those chasms actually look like when we're on the ground running. So my first question for you is, on one of your slides with regards to the timelines and towards maturity, and I note that oil and gas there is 9.5 years. Where do you see hydrogen would fit, given your current experience with hydrogen?
Yeah, I would say it's probably broadly speaking, the oil and gas sector, because we have health and safety issues that we're dealing with all the time, dealing with complex technologies and processes, and probably looking at customers not being suspicious to begin with, to see whether the technology is affordable and their price points and available to them. It's certainly, I think, a long game, not unlike, say, software or apps, which might be 5 or 6 years. You're in the hydrogen.
Because,
you're in the hydrogen field yourself. I think you would probably give me insight on what you think that might be like.
This is a tricky one, because certainly at my end, we have to create the market for it. We have to create the demand, and there's a lot of unpicking with regards to policy, current practices, even in the transport sector. And it's very hard to change people, or I guess industry that is embedded in another industry, which is the carbon industry. So so that's that extra challenge of, how we convince those early adopters, and the industry itself is a startup. So and I think that it might even go through those triple chasms that you speak about.
Yeah, so it could well be more than 9 years then.
Hopefully not. But I guess the plus side is that there's a lot of groundswell and discussion occurring, and certainly in Europe, UK, Germany especially, there's a lot of policy changes and investment occurring, which are activating that market. So we hope for the same here. And it's usually those market signals that enable confidence for startups and investors to hit the ground running there. So just on those chasms, because chasm 2 sounds quite frightening, as you say. Chasm 1 feels like we're just dipping the toes in when I superimpose my own experience as a startup. But chasm 2, how would an entrepreneur know that they're in chasm 2? And is that at the point where where they're starting to find a little bit of that product market fit?
Yeah, great question. So how do you know where you are on that journey? I think if the two ways of responding to this. One is that, let's say, we collect the data from the marketplace and we know roughly how many customers there are that we want to address. So the C max number, right? And that could change. You know, it could change when you're in the early days, you think, okay, there's only 100 customers, but as you iterate as the products change, it might suddenly become 1,000 customers. The market also grows. But let's say we get a fix on that 100 customers is our number. And we know that in this industry, it should be taking you about, say, 9 to 10 years, maybe to reach all those 100 customers, right? And then you've got maybe 10% of those, you've got 10 customers in, you're unable to get the 11th and the 12th and the 15th and the 16th, and you're somehow stuck. So your sales line will tell you if you're stuck or you're not stuck. You then kind of know you have a problem going on here. Something needs to change because you're not able to break through something, right? And that's an issue. So what you have then is a typical chasm is against the y-axis, the y line, which says, are we adding customers or not to this? What's the change of customers, right? So the reason for a chasm is you're not added any new customers at this period. So typically, when you're not adding customers, you know you're in a chasm. It's not that you're not making sales, because your existing customers might be giving you sales, but you're not adding new customers. So that would be a simple methodology to say, am I or am I not in a chasm? And if that, or Death Valley, if you will, if you're not adding customers, that's where you're kind of slightly stuck. So when you know you have your product market fit and those things are going well, you're getting generally good feedback, you're adding, but you're not crossing chasm 2, then it seems to me then all the rest of your system is not in sync with each other. Something's not quite right, okay? Why are you not adding more customers? So of course the Everett Rogers and the Jeffrey Moore storyline would be that you've got the early adopters, but you're unable to make it to the mainstream marketplace. And Jeffrey Moore's work on crossing the chasm was you find the big market and the key hook, and then you expand from there. So the mainstream marketplace that he talks about. So I think that's really interesting, because for us, that becomes like the charter customer, the first one that will buy from you, whether or not they pay you money. They become how you validate the product. The proto customers are a sampling of the mainstream, and they're beginning to validate you and give you a brand presence and give you the PR, and they're giving you some cash as well, maybe discounted. Then you have the mainstream customers. So the crossing the chasm from innovation directly to mainstream is a bit sudden. So there's a bit in the middle where we need to build out more samples, more examples. So on the and therefore you also need to therefore build out this. Sorry about that. So much for working from home, ladies and gentlemen. It happens to us here as well. I will just turn off the phone. Yeah, I do apologize. So we have this idea of building a business distinct from building product.
Great. And so, yeah, you mentioned around crossing that chasm, it could take time. and a lot of effort, as you've said in Chasm too. Is there a decision point where you go, all right, I've thrown all my resources in. At what point in that chasm do we pivot? And that's probably a really hard one to answer, eh?
It is. Chasm 2 requires a really solid team. I would say if the team is not right, I don't think Chasm 2 can be crossed unless there's a huge amount of luck involved. Because you need people by that point who really thoroughly understand the marketplace. We call it market space, by the way, because we think that there's so much confluence of technologies nowadays. The old style of segmentation by industry, classification, and so on is getting out of date. Because you're taking, for example, the Internet of Things going into oil and gas. Well, is that tech or is that oil and gas, right? Is it medical or is it technology? Med tech, and so it goes on, right? So right across many worlds that we live in now, we have to think about a space in which many cooperating, collaborating, co-creating technologies need to come together in order to make up a system that actually works in an environment. So we think more about like a market space. So bringing in the expertise that really understands that, the nuances of it, the buying signals from it, all of that, the margins, the pricing, so that hard-nosed commercial experience needs to be in the team. And then you need a decent leadership team that's actually moving things forward as well. And then you've got commercialization, business models, and positioning. So there's a lot to do. For us, for the time being, there are these 12 vectors that we've identified as what the team needs to understand. No one person can do it all, because much as we like to believe in Wonder Woman or Superman, it's hard. So getting a team of 3 or 4 people that combine is absolutely critical for crossing that chasm. And that's hard to build. That's hard to build. So it might be scary, and I might be putting a lot of people off.
About the 12 vectors.
I think that we should understand them, and then at least we know where we are, and we can figure things out. So we are currently using that in a number of different ways. We've got the health networks of Oxford and Cambridge cooperating with us. We're helping a number of companies with that. So it may be that a group of mentors in Australia could come together, start to adopt this approach, and help the local companies to navigate their way through this stuff. I've got a project going on in Latvia and another one in Austria, strangely enough, where we're using this methodology. So the entrepreneurs are beginning to see a kind of a 0 to 10 score against the 12 vectors in a little spidergram. It's okay, we're strong here, we're weak here, doing self-assessment, moving forward. So it may well be that a group of you in the hydrogen area who know your sector really well could start to provide this kind of business advice to companies that are trying to navigate and reduce the mistakes being made, increase their chances of success, and go past Chasm 1, go past Chasm 2 as well. So it doesn't all have to be
that's some
because
great
we have different animals. But here we shouldn't become like rabbits in the headlight. I guess, I don't know, in Australia, I don't know if you had rabbits in headlights there as you drive around, but it's, which is, being terrified by the approaching impending Chasm 2. So yeah,